I always knew that my job as a chef was not for the weak. Exhausting hours, burns, cuts, and the constant weight of meeting absurdly high expectations. But that night, I found out there are much worse things than an unhappy customer or a spoiled dish. It all started with a call I shouldn't have answered. It wasn't my turn, but the promise of an extra payment was too tempting to ignore. The manager seemed desperate, as if he was pushing something to me that he did not want to face himself. I arrived at the restaurant just before midnight. On the outside, the place looked the same as always, the facade clean, the luminous sign flickering as usual. But there was something in the air, something I could not identify. A silence hovered over the building, as heavy if even the wind had decided to keep away. Upon entering, I was greeted by the fluorescent lights of the kitchen, blinking at an irregular pace. Everything seemed out of place, as if someone had left in a hurry. The floor was clean, but there were wet shoe marks that made no sense. It was a dry night, no sign of rain. On the wall, I noticed a note attached to the notice board, written by hand in a hurry, almost illegible. Follow the rules, or they will consume you. My first report was a nervous laugh. I thought that Clara, a chef who usually worked the night shift, was trying to scare me. But something in the note bothered me. The ink looked fresh, as if it had been written minutes earlier. Ignoring the discomfort, I put on my apron and started to organize the kitchen. The task list was in the same place as always, but when I turned the page, I found something else, a list of rules. 1. Never answer orders made between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. They do not come from customers. 2. If you hear laughter in the pantry, do not enter, no matter how much someone familiar appears. 3. At 3:15, all clothes should be organized. A knife out of place can cost you. 4. Do not look directly at the customer of order 66. He will always be on the counter, and he will always ask for the dish of the day. It was a joke. It could only be. Clara always had a peculiar humor, but that seemed a bit exaggerated, even for her. I put the paper aside and forced myself to focus on work. However, as the dawn advanced, a feeling of heaviness began to grow in my chest. It was as if every minute I spent in that kitchen drained a little more of my energy. The normally comforting sounds of the kitchen sounded distorted, the hum of the hood, the dripping of the tap, even the occasional style of the wrong oven, wrong. At 2 o'clock sharp, I heard the phone ring. A shrill sound that cut the silence like a knife. My body froze for an instant. It was too late for a real request, but something inside me, a morbid curiosity, made me advance to the device. Took the phone, but before answering, I remembered the rule. Never answer orders between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. My heart accelerated, and a cold sweat began to run down my forehead. The call continued for a few more seconds before stopping, leaving behind an even more oppressive silence. That's when I realized the note was not a joke. And I still had many hours ahead of me. I was still trying to convince myself that everything would be a coincidence. The rules on the ticket, the phone ringing at exactly 2 a.m., it should be just my imagination playing tricks because of fatigue. But the silence that filled the restaurant seemed to intensify, choking every logical thought. I decided to go with my routine. Organize the ingredients, check the furniture, check the orders. Practical things to keep the mind busy. It was at this moment that I saw the wall clock marking 2h15. The dawn was still beginning, and a strange discomfort ran through my spine, as if the restaurant itself was watching me. The ticket with the rules was still next to the task list, as if it challenged me to ignore it. Against my will, I took the paper again, reporting each line. The words, although simple, carried a weight that I could not explain. It was as if each sentence was less a warning and more a threat. I tried to distract myself by organizing the bench on the bench. I was putting each knife, regular and spoon in the right place, as I always did. But when I finished and looked back, something stopped me. One of the knives had fallen on the ground. No, that doesn't make sense. I was sure that I left it on the stand. I bent down to grab it, but hesitated. The knife was positioned in a strange way, with the blade pointing directly at me. It seemed deliberate. I picked it up carefully and positioned it, trying to ignore the growing feeling of paranoia. Back at work, I heard a sound coming from the pantry. A low, almost imperceptible sound, as if someone was breathing in there. I stopped and looked at the door. It was half open, revealing only a dense darkness on the other side. I forced myself to keep thinking about our math, but the sound became clearer. It was laughter. It is not a loud or obvious laugh, but something muffled, as if someone was trying to laugh without being heard. My mind went back to the second rule: if you hear laughter in the pantry, do not enter, no matter how familiar it seems. That look like someone I know made me shudder. I didn't know exactly what I wanted, but the words mentioned caused a doubt. For a moment, I thought about opening the door. After all, what could be there? A mouse, perhaps, or just an air leak making the sound like something it wasn't. But when I stepped towards the pantry, I felt something inexplicable, a sudden chill, as if I had entered a freezer. I moved away from the door instinctively, with my heart pounding. There was no more laughter, but the silence that worsened was worse. It was dense, heavy, and seemed to swallow any natural sound. To try to fool my mind, I went to the main counter where the restaurant received customers. The empty space seemed more sinister now. The organized tables, the stacked chairs, everything seemed right but at the same time wrong, as if I was in a replica of the restaurant, not in the real place. I need to occupy myself. I went back to the kitchen and recommended organizing the furniture. But again, something puzzled me. The knives were all out of place. It was not possible. I had just arranged them, one by one. This time, the nervousness turned into panic. With tremendous hands, I looked around. There were footprints on the ground, wet and fresh, exactly where I was a few minutes ago. Footprints that weren't mine. Looked at the clock. Less than 10 minutes to 3 o'clock, and the rules mentioned something about the customer of order 66. I didn't know what it was supposed to be, but somehow, I felt like I didn't want to find out. As I was arranging the knives for the third time, I heard something new. A sound coming from behind me, like a light wooden slap being stomped. When I turned, there was no one. Just the note, still nailed to the wall, swaying slightly as if a breeze had just passed through it. And that's when you realized, the restaurant was not empty. At 2:59, the silence that dominated the restaurant was interrupted by a sound that made me freeze, the phone ringing again. I hesitated for a second, feeling a squeeze in my chest. I knew what it was, but I didn't want to admit. The clock on the wall marked exactly 3h when I answered. The voice on the other side of the line was muffled, difficult to understand. It seemed a mixture of suggestions and murmurs, as if a person spoke from inside a tunnel. I forced my attention, trying to catch something clearer, but what I heard was a request for something that did not make sense. The voice asked for a special dish. The sentence was clouded, but what bothered me most was the feeling that it was not a common customer. Something was wrong. Something was profoundly wrong. I knew there should be rules, that I should ignore the request, but the fear of disobeying and the consequences it could bring overpowered me. I decided to prepare the order. I can't think clearly anymore. It was as if the environment around me had been distorted, as if every movement of mine was guided by a greater force that I could not control. I prepared the dish as quickly as possible, a simple pasta dish with sauce, something generic, something that would not raise suspicion. However, as I was packing the ingredients, the kitchen seemed to get darker, as if the lights were going out of their own accord. I went to the counter, waiting for the customer to appear, but no one appeared. The dish was ready, hot, but there was no one to receive it. I looked at the clock. It was 3:05. The request was before my eyes. I saw the dish disappear, as if the air had swallowed it up, as if it had never existed. I was paralyzed. What was happening? The rules said that orders made between 2H and 3H did not come from customers, but how could it be? How does a dish disappear like that? It doesn't make sense. I was starting to question my sanity. That's when the fire alarm went off. The high-pitched sound cut off the air, a deafening noise that made my heart go wild. I ran to the control panel, but as soon as I hit the button to deactivate it, everything became stranger. The smell that invaded the kitchen was unbearable, like something rotting, something rotten and filthy. The smell was so strong that it almost made me vomit. The air was heavy, thick, and seemed to suffocate me. Each breath was harder, as if the oxygen was being drawn out of the room. I tried to force the exit door, but it didn't move. You looked again at the kitchen and I saw that the atmosphere seemed different. The dolls were cluttered, spread out in ways that there was no way to explain. Some facades were out of the supports, others were buried in the walls. And the strangest, the footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were now everywhere, as if something had circulated there, watching me. Went to the pantry, which was even darker than before. The laughter was back, muffled, distant but unmistakable. I knew that I should walk away, but something pulled me into the darkness. My curiosity, fear, I don't know what exactly, but I was paralyzed by the feeling that the answer was there. Opened the door with a trembling hand. Inside, the space was even deeper than I remembered, as if the pantry was expanding, stretching beyond the physical limits of the restaurant. The smell of rot became even stronger, as it came out from inside the shelves. I didn't know how long I'd been there, motionless, listening to the laughter. But when I finally turned to leave, something stopped me. The door was locked, as if someone had been instructed to close it behind me. I was trapped. I started knocking on the door, screaming, but my voice sounded muffled, as if the house itself was trying to silence my screams. My body was shaking, and I knew that at any moment something much worse than a simple request could happen. When I finally managed to open the door, the kitchen was empty again. The alarm had stopped, the smell had disappeared, and everything seemed as if nothing had happened. But evil was there somewhere waiting. I knew that I was no longer alone. The kitchen was in absolute silence. I was breathing hard, trying to understand what had just happened. The environment, once muffled and distorted, seemed to have returned to normal, but everything inside me knew that something was not right. The clock on the wall marked 3:30. I didn't know how much time I spent in the pantry, but the marks of my sweaty hands on the door told me that it was enough time to change everything. I forced myself to look at the ticket with the rules. The words, "Now," are clearer than ever. At 3:15, all the furniture should be organized. A knife out of place can cost you dearly. I tried to ignore the growing sense that the place was watching me. I returned the knives to their proper place, but I could not avoid the view that they were crooked middles, misaligned, as if something had passed by there and repositioned them without me noticing. A tremor runs through my spine. That's when I heard the sound. A soft, almost inaudible step coming from the front door. My eyes fixated on the door. I didn't want to see, but something forced me to look. A shadow moves slowly with a precision that does not belong to a human being. I could feel something was coming, something that shouldn't be there. With my heart racing, I went to the kitchen entrance, trying to keep my cool. But the restaurant was empty, or should be. On the counter, Order 66 was there. The order label was visible, and the only thing written on it was, the dish of the day. There was no more information. It was a request like any other, but something about that number made me cold. Request 66. I remembered the rules: do not look directly at the customer from Order 66. He will always be on the counter, and he will always ask for, the dish of the day. My mind was in pieces. I was alone, but not. Something was watching me, and growing fear took hold of me. I knew that if I followed the rules, I should not look at him. Should not, but what would happen if I just went on? I jumped to the front of the counter, almost without realizing that I was doing this. When I looked away, there he was. Oh, customer. He was sitting in a corner of the restaurant, right by the window, his head down. His presence was strange. The lean body, the fallen shoulders, the dark and shaggy hair. He was on his back, but I could feel his eyes burning over me. I tried to look away, but was unable. Something in his behavior held me back. Fear grew, but there was also a strange sense of need to know more. He did not move. He was just there, waiting. My feet were still as I approached slowly. The feeling of being in a trap intensified with each step. But before I could reach him, the client called to his head. His eyes had no ordinary eyes. They were deep, black, without pupils, without life. They stared at me with such disturbing intensity that my whole body froze. Time seemed to slow down. I didn't know what to do, I didn't know what to say, but the only thing I could do was swallow dry while he reached for the plate. Without a word, he sent to the empty plate, and then, as if expecting something, looked directly at me. A sense of despair took hold of me, but the words came out of my mouth without me having control over them. The dish of the day. I didn't know what was going on. The client had not said a single word, but the pressure, the emptiness, the feeling that he already knew what I would do, swallowed me. I was trapped, and did not know how to escape. Suddenly he declared, with the agility of a shadow, and headed for the counter. His movement was precise, as if every step had been rehearsed. He took the plate and looked at me one last time, but this time his eyes were empty. As if all humanity had been taken away from them. The customer turned and left without making a sound. The moment the door closed, a feeling of trouble invaded me, but at the same time I knew that something was still not right. The restaurant was quiet again, but it wasn't a quiet silence. Something was about to happen, and I didn't know what. The clock was 3:45, and I felt that I had more rules to follow, more ways to go to try to survive the night. But what scared me most was the question that hung in the air: what would happen if I disobeyed the rules? The door closed with a muffled bang. The sound of the customer disappearing into the darkness of the world outside seemed to prolong, an echo that crept through the empty corridor. The restaurant, which before seemed alive, was now motionless, stagnant in a dense and suffocating quietness. The plate that the customer had taken was empty, but strangely I could not look away from him. He was there, somehow, waiting. As if the presence of that dish was more a warning than a meal left behind. I slowly moved away from the counter, trying to ignore the tremor that ran through my body. The sight of that client, his eyes empty and piercing, was stuck in my mind like a scar impossible to erase. I knew I had made the wrong choice by looking at him. I knew this wouldn't be the last time he would show up. Rules don't lie. The second rule was clear: do not look directly at the customer of Order 66. He will always be on the counter, and he will always ask for the dish of the day. But I was looking. And the worst, I had spoken. I had said those words unintentionally, as if my mouth had been controlled by something other than me. The fear that began to form within me was no longer only psychological, it was visceral, palpable. Looked at the clock. 3:50, only 10 minutes have been done since request 66. 10 minutes that changed everything. I need to act. If the client was not the only problem, the rules were. There was no more restaurant than I knew, and the instructions left by Jackson were the only chance to survive that turn. Even though I knew that following the rules forced me to become something greater than myself, something I could not control, I had no other choice. Took the note again. The words were clearer now, as if they were forming as my mind approached the truth. The third rule was, at 4 o'clock, the screams start by hand. Do not go to the upper floor. Stay on the kitchen level. I didn't know exactly what would happen at 4 a.m., but whatever it was, it couldn't be good. I looked up the stairs that led to the upper floor. Upstairs, the restaurant had a storage area and some restrooms. A part of the building that I never needed to explore. I never feel the need to go there. But something told me that if I followed the third rule, it could save me. This decision was not easy. But the clock was ticking at 3:55, and time was running through my fingers like sand. There was no more room for hesitation. Gradually, I began to hear a sound. It was distant, but was approaching. Something like the creaking of old wood, accompanied by an undifferentiated murmur. My instincts told me not to listen, to keep myself in my place. But the sound increased. And, with every step I took towards the ladder, the sound intensified. It was a message, as if the building itself was talking to me, whispering something I didn't want to hear. But then everything stopped. The sound ceased abruptly, and for a moment I could hear only my heart beating. I knew something was about to happen, and any wrong move could be fatal. That's when I saw the shadow. She came out of the kitchen entrance, slowly sliding down the wall like a black curtain. I could not see clearly what it was, but it was there, right in front of me, watching. A smell of rot is left in the kitchen, stronger than ever. The shadow moved, and I, completely paralyzed, could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was illusion. It was when the pantry door opened with a bang. I hadn't touched it. The door seemed to move by itself, and the shadow seemed to want to drag me inside. I could see something inside, something much more sinister than I was prepared to face. A figure moved slowly, its shape writhing as if it were made of shadows and nightmares. What I did next was what I feared most. I ignored the third rule and went up the stairs. As my feet went up, the air got heavier. The smell of rot now mixed with something else, something metallic and dirty. Each step seemed an eternity. When I finally reached the top, what found me almost made me fall back. The hall was full of paintings. But they were not normal paintings. They showed scenes of a night just like the one I was living. Each picture was a distorted scene, a vision that seemed to recall my own struggle against something I could not comprehend. I looked down the end of the hall, where a door was half open. Something moves in there. Same figure, same shadow. But this time she was calling me. Not with words, but with gestures, as if she wanted to invite me in. It was then that I heard the cry. A high-pitched and desperate cry, which seemed to come from the bottom of the earth, as if the very darkness were crying out for me. And at that moment, I knew there was no way back. I had already crossed a line, and whatever it was, there was no way to escape. The cry seemed to penetrate my soul, a vibration that came not only from the ears, but from inside me. It was as if the building itself was begging for something, as if every wall, every piece of wood were in agony, and I was the only witness to this silent suffering. The sound echoed in my mind, leaving a feeling of uncontrollable urgency, as if I had to run or be forever stuck in this anguish. The figure in the door, that shadow, kept moving, but this time, it didn't seem to want me. She was waiting for me, challenging me. The gestures were now more aggressive, more rushed. I could see a pale glow in the contours of being, something between the visible and the invisible, as if it were a distorted projection of a parallel reality. I wanted to run away, but something stopped me. It was as if my body had been paralyzed, as if the bones themselves were frozen, unable to move. I took a deep breath, and then the memory of the rules came to my mind. Rule number 4, the last one to be followed, said, if you reach the door on the upper floor, do not enter. He who enters never comes back. I looked at the door half open, the shadow's gestures continuing to call me. But the phrase kept pounding in my mind, never come back. Fear took hold of me, and a gloomy idea came to mind. If I went in there, it would mean that I would never leave the restaurant. The door in front of me was not just an entrance to another space, it was a prison, a trap that once crossed, would condemn me to stay there forever. I turned to the stairs. My instinct was telling me to get down, get out of there, do what the rules said. But the cry down there intensified, now more desperate, as if I was being called for an impossible choice. The fear of the door on the upper floor and the fear of the scream were clashing, paralyzing me. That's when something happened. The shadow moved faster, coming out of the door and approaching me. I could feel her presence in every fiber of my body. The temperature dropped, and I knew that if I stayed there, if I stayed a second longer, would not have more chances. I had no choice. With a scream stuck in my throat, I turned the body and ran up the stairs. My feet stumbled on the steps, and the sound of my running seemed to be muffled by something. Something chases me, something invisible and hungry. Each step seemed higher than the previous one, as if the ladder widened to keep me trapped, to make me lose control. The cry below became a roar, and I knew that if I did not come out soon, something much worse than the shadow would reach me. When I finally got to the ground, the kitchen was cold, even more than before, as if I had been transported to another place, another time. The restaurant was quiet again, but the feeling that something still watched me was not absent. The door to the upper floor was long, but his presence seemed still to add me, like a flame that refuses to extinguish itself. I looked at the clock, 4:05. Whatever it was, I knew that time was running out. Something had changed in the structure of the place. The restaurant was different. The air seemed denser, the light weaker, and the sound. The sound seemed to come in all ways. I was caught in something much bigger than I imagined. And now, whatever was going on, I was no longer in control. The last rule, which I had not followed, was about to reveal itself. At 4:30 a.m. you must close your eyes and wait. If you wait, what comes will be worse than any nightmare. The words were stamped in my mind. I didn't want to know what was coming. But somehow, I knew there was no time for doubt. The time was coming. The only thing left for me to do was close my eyes. Close my eyes and wait. I took a deep breath, but nothing could prepare me for what was to come. Jackson's rules became a prison, an invisible current that forced me to follow them, even though I knew that each decision would take me further away from the reality I knew. The clock struck 4:20. Whatever it was, I had no way to avoid it anymore. The restaurant seemed to have changed around me. The light now blinked with an unsettling intensity. The corridors that were once wide and familiar now became tight, as if the building itself was shrinking, sending me inside. I looked once more at the note, the words of the last rule still etched in my mind. At 4:30 a.m., you must close your eyes and wait. Otherwise wait, what comes will be worse than any nightmare. What was worse? I didn't want to find out. But at the same time, a sense of inevitability took hold of me. Closing eyes seemed to be the only choice. I knew that, by opening my eyes, I would face something I would not be able to understand, something I could not escape. That's when I heard the door open. The sound of wood squeaking, low and insidious, cut the silence. I didn't turn around, didn't want to see what was on the other side. I knew it required more choice. Something was entering the restaurant, something that should not be there. But I have to follow the rules. I knew that. Gradually, the pressure does not increase. It was as if the place itself were becoming denser, heavier, as if he was trying to swallow me. The heat of the kitchen was dissipating, and the cold breeze that before passing through the windows turned into a cold wind that cut the meat. And then, as a suggestion, I heard the voice. But it was not a human voice. It was something deeper, more primitive, something I should not be able to speak. "You won't wait, will you?" The phrase echoed, resonating in my bones. I froze. A shiver runs through my spine. It was impossible to describe. The voice came from all directions, but it was not visible to anyone. It was as if the space around me had become alive, and he spoke directly to me. I knew that, hearing these words, everything I had done so far would become an irreversible decision. I wasn't at the limit of my endurance, but I knew what I should do. I looked at the clock again. 4:25, time was running out, and the feeling that there was no more escape squeezed my chest like an iron claw. Closed my eyes. What happened next was a sense of loss. A sense of dissolving, as if I were falling without ground, without direction. Reality seemed to be crumbling around me. I felt the elements, the air, the cold, the ground, becoming distant, unreal, as if the world in which I lived was being erased, a pencil trace erased from a paper. Silence took hold of me. There were no children, no movement. But somehow I knew I was not alone. I was being watched, surrounded, like a trapped prey. An increasing pressure, a presence that could not be ignored, enveloped me. I was inside something that was no longer a simple supermarket, it was no longer a work routine. I was in a place between the real and the unreal, where rules were the only things that still kept me anchored. I kept my eyes closed, though fear gripped me. I knew that if I opened them, everything would end. The worst happened. I waited, and more, until finally the sound came back. Not the sound of a simple thing, but something that seemed to come from the bottom of an abyss. A roar of metal, as if the structure of the restaurant was twisting and stretching. The air became denser, dirtier, and something crawled down the floor. I knew I should not open my eyes. Whatever it was too late to turn back. But then I heard something even more terrifying. It was a voice, but not the same. It was a familiar voice, a voice that I knew well. "You should have heard the rules, Tom." The feeling that something was watching me became unbearable. I could no longer keep my eyes closed. Fear was consuming me. I knew what was about to happen. With my body shaking, I opened my eyes. I opened my eyes, and the world around me fell apart. Was no longer in the restaurant. The walls that were once covered with white tiles and lit by cold lamps were now distorted, undulating as if they were made of smoke. The floor, once simple and immaculate, was now covered with a thick layer of dust and dirt, and the ceiling, which seemed to stretch into infinity, was stained as if the building itself were rotting. The light coming in through the windows was dim, like a dead light, and the atmosphere was dense, almost damp, as if the air were saturated with a strange and immortal presence. And then I saw. The figure was before me. The shadow I had seen before, but now it was clearer, more tangible, as if materializing from the void. It was like a dark stain against the background of the inheritance, a human form but incomplete, as if it had been created from nightmares. His eyes were two black holes, empty, lifeless. The mouth, if it could be called that, was twisted in a grotesque smile, and his arms extended unnaturally, as if they were made of threads of shadow that did not connect properly. It was an aberration, an exception to everything that should be normal. I knew what it was. This wasn't just any creature. This was what happened when the rules were broken. That was the price of ignoring Jackson's warning. The silence that filled that space was overwhelming. The restaurant was disappearing around me, and the shadow was slowly approaching, step by step, as if savoring my apprehension. I wanted to run, scream, run away, but something in me told me that no matter what I did, would never escape from that place. I was already trapped there, inside a distorted reality, which offered no way out. And then the voice came again, but it was not the same. It was deeper, more cruel. You thought the rules didn't matter, Tom. But you still don't know what this place really is. You don't know who you really are. Those words penetrated my mind like sharp knives. I could not fully understand what I was saying, but somehow the words nested in my head, creating a deep hole that began to swallow everything I believed I knew. The restaurant, it was not just a place. It was not just a supermarket. It was a trial field, a trap designed to attract those like me, those who get lost in the rules, forget the limits. And I was chosen. I didn't know why. I didn't know what really happened to Jackson. But all this is part of a cycle that repeats itself, where new employees were attracted and then consumed by something much larger, something old. The shadow stepped forward, and the room darkened even more. The air seemed strange, as if it was trying to suffocate me. I could no longer breathe. I could not move. All that remained was to wait for what came next. I remembered Jackson's words, those rules, those cursed instructions he had left. It was clear to me now, it wasn't a matter of survival. It was a matter of participation. The restaurant wasn't a place you could escape. He swallowed you, transformed you, and was part of an eternal cycle that would never end. I had been a pawn in a game that I didn't even understand, played by something beyond my comprehension. The shadow moved more, his arms now almost touching my skin, and I felt the fear in its touches, as if it were a liquid, cold substance crawling through my spine. She was telling me something, but I couldn't hear it anymore. The words were incomprehensible. The only thing I knew was that no matter what I did, the cycle would continue. I was the new Jackson. And as the darkness enveloped me, I understood. The night shift never ends. It repeats itself, forever. And I had been condemned to be part of it. The restaurant, it was not just a place. It was not just a supermarket. It was a trial field, a trap designed to attract those like me, those who get lost in the rules, forget the limits. And I was chosen. I didn't know why. I didn't know what really happened to Jackson. But all this is part of a cycle that repeats itself, where new employees were attracted and then consumed by something much larger, something old. The shadow stepped forward, and the room darkened even more. The air seemed strange, as if it was trying to suffocate me. I could no longer breathe. I could not move. All that remained was to wait for what came next. I remembered Jackson's words, those rules, those cursed instructions he had left. It was clear to me now, it wasn't a matter of survival. It was a matter of participation. The restaurant wasn't a place you could escape. He swallowed you, transformed you, and was part of an eternal cycle that would never end. I had been a pawn in a game that I didn't even understand, played by something beyond my comprehension. The shadow moved more, his arms now almost touching my skin, and I felt the fear in its touches, as if it were a liquid, cold substance crawling through my spine. She was telling me something, but I couldn't hear it anymore. The words were incomprehensible. The only thing I knew was that no matter what I did, the cycle would continue. I was the new Jackson. And as the darkness enveloped me, I understood. The night shift never ends. It repeats itself, forever. and I had been condemned to be part of it. The restaurant took me. He would always take.